I believe that we are going to get along with the Russian people very, very well.
The Iron Curtain has descended across the country.
And resolute action.
I shall go to Korea.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party.
That we shall pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe. Hell no, we won't go.
We believe that peace is at hand.
Will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States.
We understand each other better, and that's a key to peace.
The Eagle and the Bear, dispatches from the Cold War. Dateline 1973, Chile. The world's only freely elected Marxist president is overthrown by military coup.
Caminando, caminando, voy buscando libertad. Ojalá encuentre camino para
3 years earlier, in 1970, Chilean folk singer Victor Jara was singing about revolution. A peaceful revolution, the first of its kind. Without guns, without a guerrilla army, the Chilean left had seized power. In Chile, the oldest democracy in Latin America, they had done it democratically. In September 1970, Salvador Allende became the first Marxist leader to come to power through free elections.
En Cuba, Fidel Castro
In Cuba, Fidel Castro
tuvo que luchar con las armas en la mano,
had to fight arms in hand
porque no había otra salida.
because there was no other way to do it.
En Chile hemos usado el camino legal.
And in Chile, we have followed the legal channels. That's the difference.
Allende won by a narrow margin, not uncommon in Chile. But even before his inauguration, Allende's right to rule was being challenged by powerful opponents.
Now, we have one country in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba, that is exporting revolution, and we didn't want another one, Chile, doing it.
Richard Nixon was engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State, once said, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." Nevertheless, as Salvador Allende took office, he made it clear that he thought he had a mandate to move Chile toward socialism. A son of the upper middle class, Allende became a favorite of the poor and working classes. He said that too many were going hungry because the country's wealth went to a minority of Chileans and a handful of powerful foreign companies. American companies dominated the Chilean economy. Oil companies, the telephone company, and 80% of the country's copper industry, Chile's biggest source of revenue. Allende's program called for putting big business in Chilean hands.
Pero lo que sí es fundamental que se entienda
But what should be really understood
que este país
is that this country
no será base de ningún país,
will never become the basis of any other country.
solo base de Chile para los chilenos.
It's only the basis of Chile for Chile.
Ni base norteamericana ni base soviética.
Neither Russian nor North American basis.
Allende played it very cleverly. He played it as a Chilean would rather than as a Cuban would, the Chileans being, frankly, less volatile than the Cubans, I would say. But on the other hand, there wasn't any question about his turning all the screws that he possibly could in the direction of making Chile a Marxist state.
In November 1971, Fidel Castro arrived in Chile. As the Cuban leader toured the country with Allende, Richard Nixon saw his most dire predictions coming true.
I remember months before Allende came to power in 1970, an Italian businessman came to call on me in the Oval Office. And he said, if Allende should win the election in Chile, and then you have Castro in Cuba, what you will in effect have in Latin America is a red sandwich. And eventually, it'll all be red.
By the time Allende celebrated his first year in office, he had nationalized the American-owned telephone company ITT. A few weeks later, the government took over the copper companies as well.
I knew that was coming. All you had to do was to read his campaign speeches.
Nixon struck back, quietly moving to cut off loans to Chile.
Chile, of course, is interested in obtaining loans from international organizations where we have a vote. And I indicated that wherever we had a vote, where Chile was involved, that unless there were strong considerations on the other side, that we would vote against them.
As credits dried up, Chilean industry began to suffer. U.S. businesses stopped supplying American parts for the machinery that drove the Chilean economy. Prices rose and frustration grew. Chileans had to wait online for food and staples that were running short. After 2 years, Allende's socialist experiment seemed to be failing. There were strikes. Chilean housewives marched in protest of the Allende government. Pro- and anti-Allende demonstrators fought in the streets of Santiago. The Carabineros, Chile's military police, moved to stop them. Allende gave no ground. In November 1972, Fidel Castro was back in Chile. Castro addressed Allende supporters at a rally in the National Soccer Stadium. Who has learned more in this last year, he asked them. The fascists who oppose this government, or you? We have, the crowd responded. No, Castro warned, they have. Not far from the stadium, anti-Allende protesters had taken to the streets. In the stadium, Allende took the podium. The only way they will get me out of office before my term is up, he said, is to riddle my body with bullets. By 1973, his third year in office, Salvador Allende was losing support on both political right and left. The military was showing signs it had lost confidence in it. The army had begun harassing and arresting Allende supporters. The left was becoming impatient, urging Allende to crack down on the army. Allende told his closest advisors he planned to call for a plebiscite, a national vote on whether the Chilean people supported his beleaguered programs. There was no plebiscite. On September 11th, the Chilean military moved to overthrow the Allende government. With tanks moving toward the National Palace, Allende refused to resign, making good on his promise to defend Chile's democracy with his own life. From his office, he made his final radio address.
La última oportunidad en que me pueda dirigir a ustedes. Otros hombres, este momento gris y amargo, donde la traición pretende imponer. Sigan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo, abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores! Estas son mis últimas palabras. Tengo la certeza de que mi sacrificio no será en vano.
A short time later, the Moneda was in flames and Allende was dead. Whether killed by the soldiers who stormed the palace or by his own hand remains a matter of dispute. In the days following the coup, soldiers rounded up thousands of Chileans. Workers, students, politicians, and artists were arrested and imprisoned. The folk singer Victor Jara was captured and tortured. His hands were broken. Later, he was killed. Many were taken to the National Soccer Stadium and held prisoner there.
I saw quite a lot of brutality. I've seen a man with 3 men with guns on him, and then disappearing for a little while into the shade at the back of the stadium, into a room at the back of the stadium, and then we saw somebody, just could make him out, being carried out.
Richard Barber and Adrian Jansen, British subjects, were imprisoned in the National Stadium as well.
The second morning we were there, guards came in, told us to stand against the wall, and presented brooms to a number of us. One broom was presented to me. I paused for a moment, but thankfully I accepted the broom and started to sweep. Another British fellow there said, "I'm British, I'm here for no reason at all, I refuse to do this." He was pulled down from the bench he was standing on. We'd all been instructed to stand on the bench. He was rifle-butted in the back and then very hard in the stomach.
And these are by carabineros who may ultimately be decent men, but they've been turned on to a sort of rich diet of xenophobic and hatred of all foreigners. They've been told it's the foreign extremists, it's the foreigners who are responsible.
After 128 years of democracy, Chile had become a military dictatorship. Arrests and disappearances continued as the generals who had planned the coup consolidated power. Their leader was Augusto Pinochet, who had been supreme commander of the armed forces under Allende.
As far as politics are concerned, Chile will have to continue being what it has always been, a democratic, freedom-loving country, with freedom to worship, to think, to work. Not a normal democracy. It must be strong to repress anything which might try to destroy this idea of democracy.
In Santiago, bodies floated in the currents of the Mapocho River each morning, victims of killings the night before. In all, it is estimated that more than 30,000 people were killed during the coup. Vociferous protest and open debate had been replaced by a great, fearful silence. Allende supporters that had not been killed or captured went underground. On September 28, 1973, 17 days after the military coup, the Chilean people broke their silence. They poured into the streets of Santiago for the funeral of the poet Pablo Neruda. Neruda was a Nobel Prize winner and one of Chile's most outspoken leftists. His last days had been painful. The poet was in bed dying of cancer at the time of the coup. Soldiers laid siege to his house and ordered him out of bed so they could search the sheets. His doctor had disappeared, arrested and held as an Allende supporter. Neruda died 12 days later. His funeral was to be the last mass protest inside Chile for the next 10 years. For the most part, Chilean families dealt quietly with their grief. It took weeks for many to learn that husbands, parents, and children arrested in the days of the coup were dead. The junta had moved to isolate the remaining leaders of the Allende movement. His closest advisors were held in a concentration camp on an island near Antarctica. Most would remain imprisoned on Dawson Island for 8 months.
Allende lost eventually. Allende was overthrown eventually. Not because of anything that was done from the outside, because his system didn't work in Chile, and Chile decided to throw it out.
That was not clear. Even before the coup, there had been allegations that the CIA and ITT had conspired against Allende. Both maintained they had had no direct hand in the coup.
ITT did not encourage or participate in any way in any alleged plot for a military coup in Chile.
But through a series of congressional investigations, it emerged that there had been an American plan to keep Allende out of office.
You told him that you were prepared to put up the $1 million in support of a government plan for the purpose of bringing about a coalition of the opposition to Allende.
That's correct, Mr. Senator.
I thought that the United States had the policy of trying, and the testimonies here said it was to continue democracy in Chile.
Yeah. Mr. Dean, democracy, yes, as I understand the term, is the right of the people to determine their government by vote.
Well,
isn't it?
Congressmen became incensed as they learned that while Allende was in office, the CIA had spent millions agitating strikes and on propaganda to throw the economy into chaos.
Do you see any distinction between Mr. Allende and Mr. Castro? You've mentioned the two. Do you see no distinction between the two?
The distinction between Castro and
Allende?
I would say merely a distinction with a difference. That's probably all at this stage.
You disregard the fact that Allende was elected by popular vote in a regular election, and Mr. Castro took over by force of arms. Isn't that a very big distinction if you're interested in democracy?
I think we could go back into history and have some other points come up on that Castro business, Senator.
The CIA, it seemed, had been acting with both the knowledge and consent of the Nixon administration. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger denied the American government had played a direct role in the coup, but he defended CIA activities aimed at undermining the Allende government.
All of the matters to which you refer have been developed by well-established procedures in the government that have been consistently tightened, approved by the President, and briefed to the appropriate committees. This doesn't make them right. I'm just trying to explain.
Makes it all the more appalling to me, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Frank Church, who led the investigation, challenged the way the Nixon administration had chosen to fight the Cold War on Chilean soil.
You said still at another point where the age-old antagonism between freedom and tyranny is concerned, we are not neutral. Well, I agree full-heartedly with these principles as you've enunciated them, but I am puzzled. We are now told, despite these words about the principles that distinguish us as a nation, that we not only interfered for the purpose of bringing down that government in an elaborate covert action policy by the CIA, but that we were justified in doing it, if I understood the President correctly, because the Russians do it. And indeed, because the Russians spend more money doing it than we do.
The hearings went on for 3 years. In Chile, the Pinochet regime had begun to look permanent. In 1976, Allende's former defense minister, Orlando Letelier, was assassinated in Washington. He was the third exiled member of Allende's inner circle to be killed.
The murder of Orlando Letelier raises some serious questions. In September 1974, General Carlos Prats, former chief of staff of the Chilean Army, and his wife were blown up by a time bomb in a car in Buenos Aires. In October 1975, Bernardo Leighton, former vice president of Chile, and his wife were machine-gunned on the streets of Rome. Today, Orlando Letelier was blown up by a time bomb in his car on the streets of Washington.
When they are dictatorial, I would say they are dictatorial. I would also have to, on the other side, indicate that they are non-communist and that they are not enemies of the United States.
Washington embraced the Pinochet regime, even as it became one of the world's most repressive military dictatorships. The United States had sought to hold the line against communism in Chile. With American help, Marxism had been defeated there, but so had democracy. In Chile, democracy had become a casualty of the Cold War between the eagle and the bear.